It was staring down at me, its face twisted into a look of absolute, boiling, predatory rage. It was a doppelgänger. It had assumed my form, and it was radiating an intense malice that I could feel bleeding out of the glass and into the freezing cold air of my bedroom. Story 1. The Nursery Intruder. My name is Chloe Bennett. My husband Ethan and I had just bought our first home in Decatur, Georgia, right on Sycamore Drive. If you know the area, it is this beautiful, old, historic neighborhood with giant oak trees that canopy over the streets, old craftsman bungalows, and enough southern charm to make you forget you just signed away 30 years of your life to a massive mortgage. We were riding that huge high of being first-time homeowners. But more importantly, we were expecting our first child. The nesting instinct was hitting me like a freight train. We picked out the room at the very end of the second-floor hallway to be the nursery. It had this great window that overlooked the backyard, and it just felt right. The normalcy of those first few weeks was absolute chaos. It was entirely composed of painting walls, a soft pastel yellow, arguing over which brand of baby monitor to buy, and spending hours cursing in plain English trying to put together a massive, heavy oak crib from a Swedish furniture store that somehow weighed over 100 pounds. We kept the nursery door closed and locked most of the time because our cat, Jasper, had decided the new crib was his personal litter box in training. Our lives were boring, exhausting, and perfectly normal. The red flag started small. The kind of things your brain immediately tries to rationalize because you are exhausted and pregnant. For about a week, right around 2 in the morning, I would wake up and hear this sound coming from down the hall. It was a low-frequency rhythmic humming. It wasn't a song, just a vibration. I nudged Ethan awake the first time, and he just mumbled that it was the old HVAC system kicking on. It was an old house. The pipes rattled, the vents hummed. It made sense. I bought it. You want to buy it? Because the alternative is letting your imagination run wild in a house that was built before your grandparents were even born. But the hum started getting louder every single night, always at exactly 2 a.m., like clockwork. The escalation on the night of April 12th shattered any illusion of faulty plumbing. I woke up at exactly 2 a.m., but it wasn't the humming that woke me. It was the silence. It was an absolute suffocating, dead silence. The ambient noise of the house, the hum of the refrigerator downstairs, the ticking of the hallway clock, the wind outside, the crickets. It was all entirely gone. It felt like someone had thrown a heavy wool blanket over my head. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs for absolutely no reason. I looked toward the bedroom door, which was cracked open, looking out into the dark hallway. The door to the nursery at the end of the hall was standing wide open. I knew for a fact Ethan had locked it. I watched him do it before we went to bed. I slid out from under the covers, the hardwood floor freezing against my bare feet. I didn't wake Ethan. I figured maybe the latch was just faulty. Maybe the house had settled and the door popped open. I stepped out into the hallway, and the moment my foot crossed the threshold of my bedroom, the atmosphere completely changed. The temperature didn't drop, it wasn't cold, but the air itself turned incredibly thick. It felt viscous. Walking down that short, 15-foot hallway felt like trying to wade through chest-deep water. There was a physical, psychic pressure pushing back against my chest, making it incredibly hard to draw a breath. Every primal instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around, to run, to wake my husband. But I was completely paralyzed by this bizarre, hypnotic dread. My legs moved on autopilot, forcing me closer to the open door. I reached the doorway of the nursery and looked inside. The street lamp outside cast long, distorted shadows across the freshly painted yellow walls. The heavy oak crib, the one that had taken both Ethan and me lifting together just to slide against the far wall, was no longer there. It had been dragged to the exact dead center of the room. There were no scrape marks on the hardwood. There had been no sound of heavy furniture moving. Then, the auditory hum returned. But it wasn't coming from the vents. It was right next to my left ear. It was a breathless, whispered lullaby. Just a soft, sorrowful humming of a melody I didn't recognize, coming from empty air just inches away from my face. It sounded like an older woman, weeping while trying to sing. The hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. I was completely frozen, tears welling up in my eyes, unable to even scream. I looked at the crib in the center of the room. The streetlight hit the mattress perfectly. I watched, trapped in my own body, as the center of the crib mattress began to slowly, deeply depress. It was exactly like watching two invisible, heavy hands leaning their full weight onto the mattress, pressing it down inch by inch. The springs groaned under the impossible weight. Something was in there, interacting with the space meant for my baby. It was smoothing the sheets out. Suddenly, a heavy, disgusting smell washed over me. It was the overpowering stench of stale, dried earth. It smelled like an open grave, like rotting dirt that had been dug up from deep underground, mixed with dried, decaying flowers. The smell was so strong I actually gagged, my stomach twisting violently. "Chloe?" Ethan's voice boomed from the hallway behind me. He had woken up, felt the cold draft, and realized I was gone. The absolute second his voice broke the silence, the pressure in the air vanished. The invisible weight on the crib mattress instantly released, the fabric popping back up with a loud snap. The breathless humming in my ears stopped abruptly. The heavy underwater feeling evaporated, leaving me gasping for air and sobbing hysterically. Ethan ran up, grabbed my shoulders, and asked me what was wrong. I just pointed at the heavy oak crib sitting perfectly in the middle of the room. We didn't sleep in that house for the next week. We stayed at a hotel. We eventually moved the nursery to the downstairs guest room and kept that upstairs door permanently deadbolted. I don't care how historic the neighborhood is or what old native trails the house was supposedly built on. There is something trapped in that soil. Something sad, confused, and desperate. And I wasn't about to let it anywhere near my child. Submitted directly to the DeKalb County Paranormal Research Society forums. 400 block of Sycamore Drive, Decatur, Georgia. Date of incident, April 12th, 2026. Story 2. The wait on Route 119. My name is Wyatt Gibson. I work the absolute worst shift known to man at a large commercial bakery facility. I clock in at 4 a.m., which means my commute starts at 3:30 a.m. every single morning. I drive a beat-up old Ford Ranger, and my route takes me straight down Route 119, right through Homer City, Pennsylvania. If you have never driven through the old coal country of Pennsylvania in the dead of night, it is a uniquely isolating experience. The area is littered with abandoned mining towns, old rail trails, and dense woods that just seem to swallow the light. Route 119 near the Black Lick Creek overpass is notorious for this incredibly thick, pea soup fog that rolls off the water and just sits on the asphalt like a solid gray wall. The normalcy of my life was just me. A thermos of cheap black coffee, a true crime podcast on the radio, and the hypnotic yellow lines of the highway passing under my tires. The red flag dropped on the morning of April 18th. I was cruising at about 55 miles an hour, heading toward the Black Lick Creek overpass. The fog was unusually dense that morning. Visibility was maybe 20 feet in front of my bumper. Suddenly, without a single sputter, knock, or warning light, my truck just died. I don't mean the engine stalled. I mean every single electrical component in the vehicle instantly fried. The headlights cut out. The dashboard went pitch black. The radio died mid-sentence, and the power steering locked up solid. It was a complete and instantaneous electrical failure. I had to muscle the heavy steering wheel just to get the truck onto the gravel shoulder, coasting to a stop in absolute pitch-black darkness. I pulled out my cell phone to call a tow truck. The battery on my phone had been at 90% when I left my house 15 minutes ago. It was now sitting at 2%, the screen flickering wildly in the dark cab. I managed to dial dispatch, drop my location, and the phone immediately died, turning into a useless brick in my hand. I was completely stranded in a dark metal box on the side of a deserted highway, wrapped in fog so thick I couldn't even see the tree line. I sat there for about 10 minutes, shivering because the heater was dead and the Pennsylvania morning air was freezing. That is when I heard the approach. It started as a heavy crunching sound on the gravel shoulder, coming from behind the truck. My immediate thought was pure relief. I figured it was a local resident walking, or maybe a state trooper who had parked further back in the fog to come check on my vehicle. I leaned over the center console and manually cranked down the passenger side window to call out. "Hey, I'm stuck! Tow truck is on the way!" I yelled into the thick fog. That was the biggest mistake of my life. Rolling down that window broke the barrier of safety. The absolute second my voice carried out into the dark, the crunching sound on the gravel instantly stopped. I waited. Nothing. Just the dead, suffocating silence of the fog. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice trembling just a little bit. When the sounds resumed, my blood ran completely cold. The entity had adapted to the environment in a way that defied all logic. The sound was no longer heavy work boots crunching on dry gravel. It had moved onto the asphalt right next to my truck, and the sound was wrong. It was the sound of bare, wet meat slapping against the freezing cold pavement. Whatever was walking around my truck was completely waterlogged, devoid of shoes, and it was severely injured. It was dragging its right leg heavily across the asphalt. I could hear the wet, scraping sound of flesh and fabric being pulled across the rough road surface. It was slowly, methodically circling my vehicle, taking its time. I scrambled backward in my seat, pressing myself against the driver's side door, holding my breath. I frantically reached for the headlight switch and yanked it. Miraculously, the high beams flickered on, piercing a tunnel of harsh white light into the fog ahead of me. The wet, slapping footsteps were right in front of the bumper. The sound was so clear, so incredibly close, I should have been staring right at the person making them. But the road was completely empty. The entity was acoustically and physically present, yet entirely invisible to my eyes. The terror escalated to a point where my brain just completely short-circuited. I watched the thick fog swirling in the headlights, listening to the heavy, dragging footsteps move from the front of the truck down the driver's side. It was inches away from the thin metal door separating us. I could smell it now. It smelled like sulfur, rust, and stagnant, toxic water. It smelled exactly like the deep, poison mines that run under the entire county. The invisible presence slowly dragged itself to the rear of the vehicle, right near the tailgate. Suddenly, the entire rear suspension of my Ford Ranger let out a massive metallic groan. The back of the truck violently dipped down toward the pavement, the rear window right behind my head shaking in its frame. Something incredibly heavy, hundreds of pounds of sheer, dead mass, had just climbed into the bed of my truck. I was completely paralyzed. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I just sat rigidly in the driver's seat, staring straight ahead into the fog, knowing that an invisible, massive, dripping wet entity was sitting in the truck bed, less than 2 feet behind my skull. I didn't move a single muscle. I was trapped in a state of supernatural dread, a psychic suppression that kept me entirely immobilized. I sat like that for 40 agonizing, mind-breaking minutes. Every time I tried to turn my head, the suspension would creak in the back, as if the thing was shifting its weight, warning me not to look. Finally, the blinding amber strobe lights of a flatbed tow truck pierced the fog behind me. The tow driver pulled up, threw his truck in park, and walked up to my window with a flashlight. The moment his bright light hit my truck, the heavy weight in the back instantly vanished. The suspension popped back up with a loud squeak. I practically fell out of the cab, gasping for air, babbling to the tow driver about someone being in the back. He looked at me like I was insane, walked to the back of the truck, and shined his heavy flashlight into the bed. The bed of the truck was completely empty of cargo, but covering the metal liner, tracking from the tailgate all the way up to the rear cab window, were enormous, heavy, muddy footprints. They were bare feet, dripping with thick, orange, toxic sludge from the local creek. The tow driver didn't say a single word. He just hooked the truck up in record time, let me sit in his cab, and we drove away in silence. I sold the truck for scrap 2 days later and found a job that lets me work in the sunlight. The dead in Indiana County do not rest, and they are always looking for a ride out of the dark. Verified encounter submitted to the Pennsylvania Coal Region Anomaly Database. Route 119 near Blacklick Creek, Homer City, Pennsylvania. Date of incident, April 18th, 2026. Quick pause right here. Wyatt made a massive, terrifying mistake. Fueled by the desire to be helpful, he rolled down his window into the fog, effectively inviting whatever was out there to approach his truck. I have to ask you guys, if your car died on a dark, isolated highway and you heard heavy, wet footsteps circling your vehicle, would you try to call out for help? Or would you lock the doors, drop to the floorboards, and stay absolutely silent? Drop a comment right now and tell me your survival strategy, because I read every single one. While you're down there, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to Creepy Digest. Now, let's descend into our final nightmare and find out what happens when you bring the wrong antique into your bedroom. Story 3. The Antique Glass. My name is Maya Lynn. Teaching middle school is a horror story in its own right, so you would think my threshold for stress would be pretty high. I live in a charming, tightly packed 1920s brick row house in the Bird Park district of Richmond, Virginia. It's a gorgeous area, lots of scenic lakes and old architecture. It is also historically saturated in tragedy, drownings, and old Victorian secrets. But you don't really think about that when you are hunting for vintage decor on a Saturday morning. My absolute favorite weekend activity was hitting up local estate sales. That was my normalcy. Grading papers, drinking iced coffee, and hunting for cheap antiques to fill my old house. I found it at a massive estate sale just 3 blocks away on Maplewood Avenue. It was an incredibly heavy, antique standing mirror. It had a gorgeous, ornately carved dark wood frame, and the glass was that thick, slightly wavy, silvered kind you only find in pieces over 100 years old. I haggled the estate liquidator down to $50, dragged it home in the back of my SUV, and set it up right in the corner of my bedroom. It looked perfect. I should have known better. In almost every single culture on the planet, mirrors are considered liminal thresholds. They are doorways. And I had just bought a doorway from a dead man's house and put it exactly where I sleep. Almost immediately upon placing the antique glass in my home, the red flags started. I began suffering from severe, terrifying bouts of sleep paralysis. I had never experienced it before in my entire life. I would wake up at 3 in the morning, my mind completely alert, but my body entirely frozen, pinned to the mattress by an invisible, crushing weight on my chest. I would lie there in the dark, my eyes darting frantically around the room, feeling like something was feeding on my terror. It was a psychic restraint, rendering me completely helpless, while whatever was in my room gathered its strength. On the 4th night, April 24th, the paralysis finally broke. But the reality I woke up to was infinitely worse than the nightmare. I woke up gasping for air, sitting straight up in bed. The digital clock on my nightstand read exactly 3:15 a.m. The street lamp outside my window was casting a bright, yellow beam of light across my bedroom floor, illuminating the corner where the antique mirror stood. I looked at the mirror, trying to catch my breath. Despite the ambient light filling my physical bedroom, the reflection of the room inside the glass was completely, absolutely pitch black. It wasn't reflecting the street lamp. It wasn't reflecting my dresser or my bed. It had ceased to reflect the physical world entirely. It was just an inky, swirling void. But it wasn't empty. The true mind-shattering horror was my reflection. It wasn't sitting up in bed mimicking my movements like a normal mirror should. My reflection was standing perfectly upright at the very foot of the bed inside the dark glass. It was wearing the exact same oversized college t-shirt I was wearing, its dark hair messy just like mine. But it wasn't me. It was staring down at me, its face twisted into a look of absolute, boiling, predatory rage. It was a doppelgänger. It had assumed my form, and it was radiating an intense malice that I could feel bleeding out of the glass and into the freezing cold air of my bedroom. It wasn't just an echo. It was an entity that was actively, aggressively trying to usurp my identity. It was preparing to drag me into that black void so it could take my place in the physical world. I couldn't scream. My throat was completely locked tight in pure panic. I just sat in my bed, clutching the sheets to my chest, staring at the monster wearing my face. It smiled at me, a horrific, too wide smile that showed way too many teeth. Then, the encounter escalated from visual horror to sheer physical impossibility. I watched in paralyzing terror as the figure in the glass slowly raised its right hand. It reached forward toward the front of the mirror and pressed its palm completely flat against the inside of the glass. I heard a loud, agonizing, physical creak echo through my quiet bedroom. The entity was trapped within the dimensions of the antique glass, and it was exerting massive, immense physical force against the fragile barrier, separating its world from mine. I saw the silvered surface of the heavy glass physically bow and warp outward under the pressure of its hand. It was pushing its way into my room. The wood frame groaned loudly. The glass was going to shatter. If it broke that barrier, it was going to be in the room with me. I could see the entity's twisted, angry face pressing closer to the warping glass, its eyes completely black. Pure, feral survival instinct overrode the paralysis. I threw myself out of the bed, grabbed the heavy, thick-down comforter off my mattress, and lunged across the room. I threw the massive blanket entirely over the top of the antique mirror, completely covering the glass from top to bottom. The second the thick fabric blinded the portal, cutting off the entity's visual anchor to my physical plane. The creaking instantly stopped. The oppressive, heavy rage in the room evaporated like a popped balloon. I didn't take the blanket off. I backed out of my bedroom, locked the door behind me, and sat on the floor in the hallway with all the lights blazing until the sun came up. The next morning, I didn't even look under the blanket. I dragged the incredibly heavy mirror, blanket and all, down my stairs, out the front door, and dumped it on the curb with a massive "free" sign on it. While I was standing there, shaking and drinking a cup of coffee on my porch, my neighbor from down the street walked by with his dog. He stopped, looked at the mirror on the curb, and chuckled. "Hey, isn't that the mirror from the estate sale down the block?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I replied, my voice hoarse. It didn't fit my vibe. He shook his head. "I wouldn't have brought that thing in my house if you paid me. You know the old man who lived there, Mr. Abernathy? He died of a massive heart attack right in his bedroom. They found him a week later. The paramedics said he was lying on the floor, staring directly up into that exact same mirror when he passed." I nodded slowly, feeling a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck, went inside and locked my deadbolt. The things we bring into our homes hold on to the histories of the people who owned them. Sometimes when a person dies looking into a threshold, they don't move on. They just get trapped in the silver, mutating in the dark, waiting for a fresh face to look back at them. Verified testimony submitted to the Virginia Paranormal Artifact Registry. 1102 Maplewood Avenue, Richmond, Virginia. Date of incident, April 24th, 2026. If these human-centric horrors made you want to cover up your mirrors tonight, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Before you go, head down to the comments and tell me, which of these 3 nightmares terrified you the absolute most? Are you more afraid of the invisible presence in the nursery, the muddy entity in the truck bed, or the doppelganger trapped in the antique glass? Sound off below. Let's get a discussion going. If you have your own true scary experiences, email them to the address in the description below. Remember, the dark is never truly empty. Stay vigilant, trust your survival instincts, and whatever you do, never stare too deeply into a mirror at 3 a.m. Good night.